Plagiarism, fraud, misconduct. These are issues that create problems whenever we hear about them. Somebody's got into a problem, or somebody is, people are worried that somebody is getting into a problem. So all material in these slides is not original. Most of it comes from sources such as the Committee on Publication Ethics, UK, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the World Association of Medical Editors, the Office of Research Integrity, the US, and Lauren Ferry, who's Vice President Research Integrity at the University of Toronto, and Elizabeth Wager, who at one point in time was the chair of the Committee on Publication Ethics. There is also some material which has come from Margaret Winker, who's, but very little, who's a trustee of the World Association of Medical Editors. So I don't have the slide on most of my, or such a declaration on most of my other talks, but I have it on this talk because this is the right thing to do. You must tell people that the slides, that the material in your slides is original or not original. So here's a declaration for you. So look at this. A senior clinician is requested to write a chapter for a new book. He's written an original article on the subject recently. Since the book and the article are totally different formats for different audiences, he produces the text, the tables, and diagrams from his published paper in his chapter. You have a problem with this? Anybody? Yes, no?
The journal
Yes.
holds copyright.
Sorry?
The journal
Whether the
holds
permission was taken.
Take permission from the journal before you write. Okay. So I take permission from the journal before I write. The journal says, okay, go ahead.
So if it's his own, what is the issue?
So if it
It
is his
can
own,
be
and there's no.
reproduced after taking due permission from the journal.
Okay, so I don't only need to take permission, I also need to tell the reader that this is material that has been already written up before. So I think what is important is that one needs to remember that we need to conform to certain ethical standards. These are actions that we do or certain kinds of behavior, and these relate to conducting research as well as publishing research. Okay, so now you would say, does this happen? Are there instances where people have actually indulged in misconduct? Yes, there are enough instances. In 1974, an immunologist by the name of Summerlin was doing some experiments, didn't succeed, wanted extension of his research grant, and therefore took a photograph of a white mouse and painted a black patch on that mouse, and tried to show that his experiments of transplanting skin of black mice onto white mice had worked. While it actually hadn't worked, all the work that has been done was with the sleight of a pen, a black colored pen. In 1994, the US Congress, the equivalent of the Indian Parliament, started getting worried about the lay press talking about a lot of issues of misconduct and fraud in science. And they actually set up something equivalent to or similar to a commission of inquiry, and found that at that point in time, there were 57 confirmed cases. In 1952, for the discovery of streptomycin, a Nobel Prize was given to Albert Schatz and Selman Waksman. One was the guru, the other was the chela. The guru got all the credit, the chela was left out. And the chela kept accusing the guru of stealing what he had actually done. All of us have heard of Eugene Braunwald. He was editor-in-chief of Principles of Internal Medicine, Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine. He had somebody working with him called John Darcy. And John Darcy, interestingly, probably did more fraudulent publications than anybody else ever, and got caught out. Similarly, the Nobel laureate David Baltimore, who was also the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, he had to step down from his position as the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. In addition to that, he had to apologize to people. because there was somebody, he did no misconduct. All that happened was that there was a whistleblower who said that work in a lab of which he was overall supervisor was indulging in fraudulent work. More recently, there was a paper on breast cancer that got presented at the American Association of Surgical Oncology meeting, Clinical Oncology meeting, American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting, ASCO. And this is also now about a decade plus old. And at that conference, this particular abstract suggested that women who had metastatic breast cancer, if they underwent bone marrow transplant, then they could be cured of their breast cancer. So a single author study from South Africa, and obviously there's a strong lobby of women with breast cancer in the United States, and they lobbied with the insurance companies to get insurance companies to pay for bone marrow transplants. The insurance companies started looking at this a little more carefully, saw a single author paper, actually got this investigated, and the Lancet some years ago wrote about this whole episode where a single author who had not done the said number of bone marrow transplants, only a handful in fact had been done, and certainly didn't get the results that he was proclaiming to get. Even more recently, and maybe in your memory, there was a gentleman from Korea who was accused of some fraudulent work related to stem cell research. And the gentleman, in fact, was so upset that he committed suicide. He actually had done the fraud, but he was so upset after that that he committed suicide. There was a consortium of editors of anesthesia journals, and they went after some people who were publishing huge amounts, and they had suspicion of the quality of work that they were publishing. So Scott Rubin, who's an anesthesiologist working in the area of pain medication, something that a lot of anesthetists would work in, he never did the studies that he published. Joachim Bolt did a lot of work on colloid research, and 89 of his 102 studies were thought to be fraudulent or found to be fraudulent. Yoshitaka Fuji worked on post-operative nausea and vomiting, and all of those who are anesthetists know that all these are areas that all anesthetists work in, and they're interested in these areas because these are very important areas for them. 212 of his 249 papers were investigated, and over 150 papers had fabricated data. So this is fraud for you and the extent of fraud that can occur. So why are people more interested in this, and why do people actually go and indulge in fraud? So people indulge in fraud, people used to say publish or perish. So if you haven't published, then you perish. You don't get a research grant, you don't get an extension of your contract, etc., etc. But to my mind, when you start being fraudulent in such large numbers, then obviously there are other concerns. And one wonders whether these people are actually addicted to being to a fraudulent behavior. But that's something that you want to pick up and recognize very early on. Ethical issues have become a major concern in the health sciences, primarily because they affect the health, the life of our patients. And therefore, both increasing instances of misconduct in research, actually doing the research, as well as in just publication. The research done was fine, you didn't get the results, so you therefore did some cooking up of your publication data and got your paper published. Some people would say that they were not aware of some of the things that they were not supposed to do. But remember, there are multiple players here, and there are multiple issues that come up whenever such things are looked at more carefully. So the people involved are very similar to the people involved in the editorial process. The paper is still at the center, and the people essentially are the editors and the authors, with the reviewers sometimes being the whistleblowers, and sometimes actually the readers being the whistleblowers. Sometimes reviewers don't pick up fraud or misconduct, and it's actually when the paper gets disseminated to a much wider audience that all this research ethics, privacy, and something different issue of a study. Sometimes agencies, they don't give you control of data. As a primary researcher, you should have control of the data, not the pharmaceutical company. So there are numerous instances of the pharmaceutical company saying you can't publish without my permission. Yes, that's fine. You've paid the money and therefore you should have some control. But if there is a dispute, you should have the final word, not the pharmaceutical company. And finally, there are people who don't register clinical trials and then wish to publish their research. And that again, though minor, but is still an issue. And there are journals who would not publish a paper which was not registered in a clinical trial registry. As far as publication related ethical issues are concerned, misconduct and fraud is something that we talked about. Plagiarism is another issue, which is something that we need to understand and be cognizant of. Redundant publications, or also known as duplicate publications, or sometimes called by another name, salami science, though it's not truly science issues. Conflicts of interest, and we'll talk a little bit about them. Privacy and confidentiality of the peer review process, especially if it is a single or a double-blinded process, and the confidentiality and the privacy of the authors as well as the reviewers. So if I submit a paper to a journal, I expect the editor of the journal to keep that information confidential and share it with the minimum number of people required to make an assessment of that paper. I don't expect that the editor would go and give copies of this paper out to each and every person on the earth and tell them what good or bad work I had done. Finally, publication ethics issues relate to authorship, and this has been covered yesterday by Dr. Rajiv Kumar, so I'm not going to talk about these at all. So publish or perish or greed is something that I've already touched upon. Can't be just publish or perish if you behave like Scott Rubin, Joachim Bolt, or Fuji, because those numbers are just astounding. How can you create such fraudulent papers? So look at scientific misconduct. The serious kinds of scientific misconduct are fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. And then there are other practices, some of which I've talked about, mentioned, not talked about, but mentioned. And these would be practices that aren't as serious as these. Fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism could actually make people lose their jobs in some countries. And even in India, institutions are now taking a very strong view of this. At the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, we have a misconduct committee to which all complaints are sent. The committee has now developed a mechanism to review these complaints. And after they come to a conclusion, they decide on the punishment, which is on a graded scale as to how severe is the error or misconduct, and based on that, the punishment. So these are issues that are becoming more prevalent and more taken more cognizance of even in India. So fabrication could happen while conducting research. Excuse me. You could do this while you were doing the experiment, or you could do it while you were writing up the research. You could introduce non-existent data or information and fabricate your final result by adding this non-existent data. Similarly, while doing the research, if you were doing a clinical research, you could actually do studies on 4 patients or record information of 4 patients, but make it 40 by filling up 36 fictitious patients' data. Falsification, on the other hand, is where you have data. In fabrication, you were creating data. It was not there. Or you were creating an experiment. You didn't know what the experiment would actually, what would happen if you were to conduct that experiment. But in falsification, you alter, conceal, or withhold data that you already have. You do this partly or you do this completely. If you do this completely, then it becomes close to fabrication. And you could do it with clinical data, or you could even do it with photographs. So therefore, editorial offices now have something called an image manipulation software. And they're able to look at images that have been submitted and see how much manipulation has been done. How much has the contrast been altered? Has the contrast been altered to an extent where a light white band has disappeared and become actually a black band? So, and the reason that's happened is because you altered the contrast. So image manipulation softwares can allow editorial offices to look at and see whether images have been manipulated. Some amount of manipulation to improve the readability of the manuscript, to improve the quality of the image is fine, but beyond that is obviously not acceptable. What about plagiarism? By definition, if you copy somebody's words, ideas, or work, then this is called plagiarism. It's not uncommon. It's a serious issue. In a number of countries, you would lose your job. In India, too, as I said, there are more and more institutions taking cognizance of these complaints that keep coming in. There was a time when people just wouldn't bother to look at what was happening. But now more and more institutions and institutional heads are willing to look at this and to take action wherever required. So can I copy a certain amount of text verbatim from somebody else? Can I? Any suggestions? Yes or no?
Yes, sir. By giving reference.
I can.
And
I
quotation.
can. If I provide a reference, is that enough? No?
It has to be quoted
You don't know?
in quotes.
Within quotes and provide a reference, then it's understandable. So if I take a sentence and it's from somebody who's written it up, I can't improve upon that sentence, then I put it up within quotes and provide a reference at the end. This means that this particular material is a quotation from this particular reference. If I just put a statement there and provide a reference at the end, that doesn't mean anything. All that it means is that this statement could have something to do with this particular reference. It may support or negate whatever I'm saying. This tends to happen more often when you write review articles rather than original articles, though I must say that I have started seeing this much more in the review of literatures that our students write for their dissertations. And that's not a healthy trend at all. Am I allowed to alter something, paraphrase something, and does that then become okay? So if I were to pick up a sentence and paraphrase it and write it, that'd be fine. But if I were to pick up a whole article and paraphrase it and then put it up as my own article, that would obviously not be fine. So is there a legal limit to plagiarism? Well, actually, no. Though the copyright law does say that you can copy 120 words, and that could be for fair use. So if I need it for educational purposes, for teaching purposes, and certain other predefined purposes, then I could use 120 words of published material from somebody, attributed to that person, and actually use it for if there was fair use of that material. But plagiarism is different from the copyright law. So there is no law which looks at plagiarism and says what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Plagiarism is an ethical issue. It's not a legal issue. Now let's look at redundant publications. You could have duplicate publications and you could have salami publications. Now, duplicate publications are publications which are very similar, have substantial overlap. You could use a duplicate publication. You could publish first in a print medium and then in an electronic medium, or the other way around. First in an electronic medium, publish as a blog, and then go ahead and publish it in a print version of a journal, without informing the journal that it's already published in a blog. Now, if you do that, that's duplicate publication. If there is substantial overlap and that appears twice, that's not acceptable. Why are editors bothered? Because of a waste of resources. It also misrepresents information. So if I were to look at 5 randomized controlled trials, 3 of which were duplicate publications, then I actually had only 3 true randomized controlled trials, not 5. And if now I were to use these 5 randomized controlled trials and do a meta-analysis, then it would create a huge counting problem. I would be counting many more patients and therefore draw incorrect results. And therefore, it has become even more important today that you don't indulge in, and if you know of duplicate publication, you inform editors of journals so that they can withdraw these publications. What is permitted? Are all these things permitted? Is it acceptable? I write an abstract, send it to a conference. Acceptable. That's all right. That's fine. That's not considered as duplicate publication. Can I go and if the conference people say present it as a poster, can I go ahead and present it as a poster? Yes, you can. Can I present it at a conference? Yes, you can. Oral presentation? Yes, you can. Can I allow this abstract to be published in a supplement of a journal and then go ahead and publish the full paper in a regular issue of the journal, of another journal or the same journal? Yes, you can. If you want to share information with the public, with the media, and you have press reports, and you want to hand out people information. So during the pandemic, there have been a number of instances where peer review has happened a little later than public disclosure. And public disclosure has happened because there was a public health emergency. So if you have a public health emergency, then certain things are acceptable. However, you can't provide detailed scientific data at press reports. So if you do a press conference, you want to tell them you've got a new vaccine, which is 100% efficacious against the mutants seen in South Africa and Brazil, then you can say this and give some sketchy pieces of information, but not actual scientific data. How many patients you studied, what were their efficacies, what are the male-female ratios, and so on and so forth. Data that you would share with a peer-reviewed journal. So generally avoid data when you have press reports and meetings. Franz Ingelfinger was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and he said that if an article is accepted but not published, then you cannot release the information to the public media. And this was known as the Ingelfinger rule. And so most journals had an embargo. If they accepted your paper, they would say, okay, you can't release data to the media till 48 hours before we publish. Or they would say, we would make a press note with your assistance and give it to the media. The only exceptions were when this had to be done in public interest, such as in the context of a pandemic, of a public health emergency. So does duplicate publication occur? Yes, it does occur. So there have been multiple studies on this. One of the studies was done by a gentleman called Ian Chalmers, who used to work with the BMJ at some point in time. He also had a big hand in setting up the Cochrane collaboration. And there have been multiple studies. In 2001, there was a paper which looked at 3 surgical journals and went back for a number of years and looked at how many papers they could find which had some overlapping information. And they found substantial overlap in almost 14% of papers. That's huge. 1 in 10 papers had a substantial overlap with another paper that was published in the journal. In ophthalmology publications in 2004, there was a paper there was a study which looked at this and found it in 1%. In 2 plastic surgery journals, they found it less frequently, and in 4 orthopedic journals a year later, they found it even less frequently. Well, a little more frequently. Now, these papers are all papers that have been published. They're in the public domain, and you can go ahead and look up these papers. There have been more after this. It's not that there haven't been more after this. And there is an overlap that does tend to occur. So if you look at the same journals, you may not find the overlap. If you look at similar journals, so same specialty journals of different regions, of different specialty, within a country, then you might find these overlaps more easily. So here's an instance where I want your opinion. A paper was published in an XYZ journal. 10 months later, the authors published something very similar in ABC journal. Papers were substantially similar. When the authors were caught out, they said, the differences. The differences are that there is an increment in numbers by about 10%. So our previous paper had 300 patients. This paper has 330 patients. So that's a 10% increase. Our focus is slightly different. Our focus previously was on preoperative imaging. Now it's on preoperative imaging and preoperative diagnosis. 3 of the authors are common, but 3 or 4 authors are different because our focus is different. What do you think about it? Acceptable or not acceptable? No?
Not acceptable.
No, sir.
Not acceptable. Why not acceptable? So how would I decide? 10% is okay, 15% is okay, 20% is okay. I previously had 300 patients. Now, 15 years later, I have 3,000 patients. Should I now publish? So it's very difficult. It's a judgment. Okay. So you're really not looking at percentages. So one of the best ways to look at that we find is a very good way is to whether you should publish again or not is if there is a change in the message, number one. So even if the increment in numbers is less than 5%, doesn't matter. If the message has changed, then you should definitely. If there's substantial addition to the message, then you should. If there is a substantial increase in the numbers, so adding strength to whatever you had concluded before. So 10 years ago, if I did a study on 200 patients and now I have 2,500 patients and I'm still getting the same results, that's a huge plus for me. And therefore I need to, this is valuable confirmation of known results. And writers are always looking for this. And therefore, here is an option for you to go ahead and publish. So if I'm not sure as to whether I should or I should not publish, then what do I do? Can I do something? So I have data. I have prepared 2 papers. One is already published. The second one is similar, but different in some aspects. So what should I do? Should I submit it? Should I not submit it?
Withdraw from publication, sir. Not.
No. I have one paper is already published. Now 5 years later or 3 years later, I have more data and I want to publish, but I'm not sure whether I have substantial difference. Submit.
Maybe a letter to the
submit along
editor.
with this paper, the previous paper to the journal, and say this is what we published so many years ago, and this is how our paper is now different. Your covering letter should detail this. Okay, and once you do that, then you're upfront. You haven't hidden behind anything. You've told people what you were doing. Once you tell people what you're doing, then that's fine. Another issue which comes up in India, and partly is related to the slow peer review process and our slow peer reviewers in India. People do multiple submissions, and they do multiple submissions in the hope that one journal would accept their paper and they can then go ahead and withdraw their paper from other journals. So there are 2 problems with this. One, it could lead to duplicate publication in the sense I as a journal editor could accept the publication and go ahead and publish it. And the other journal could accept the paper and send it to you for a proofreading, and you proofread and you submit, and you are not even aware of the fact that the first journal has actually done or published the paper. This happens frequently today, especially when you submit your paper to journals which are called pseudo journals or journals which exist only to make money. You submit your paper by mistake and then you decide to submit it to a better journal and you get caught up and you end up with a duplicate publication. Also, if you submit twice or thrice or to 3 different journals, then peer reviewers of different journals could be different, and they could end up, multiple people could end up wasting their time reviewing the same paper in different journals. Peer reviewers are very scarce. Good peer reviewers are a very scarce resource, and therefore one needs to be very careful before one does duplicate submission. It could end up in duplicate publication. It could also end up in problems for you. Simultaneous publication, is that permitted? So simultaneous publication is permitted to the extent that you provide disclosure to the people who are going to publish your paper simultaneously in their journals. So this usually happens with guidelines, with consensus statements, and such articles, where you submit the paper simultaneously to 3, 4, 5 different journals and say, we submitted this paper to multiple journals because we believe that this message should go out across a number of journals. If they agree with you, they will publish and publish simultaneously. If they don't agree with you, they'll reject your paper and send it back to you. So what is salami? You slice up a long roll of meat into small slices. So similarly, you have a single data set and you do multiple publications from that single data set. This is typically with retrospective studies, where you've collected all the data that you could, because you had case sheets available to you or you had something else available to you, and you then split up the paper into a paper which related to radiology, a paper which related to pathology, and so on and so forth. So another story. We encountered a patient who had a rare disease, and we went ahead and treated the patient. The patient had some very unique findings on radiology, on surgery, as well as on nuclear scans. So one day, a radiology resident walks up to me and says, "Sir, can we publish the paper? Publish this as a case report?" So yes, of course. I'll ask one of my residents to help you, and he and you can sit down and write it up, and then we can review it, and then we can go ahead and submit it for publication. A few months go by, I forget. I don't see these residents together, so I forget. And then suddenly I encounter these residents together again. And I said, what happened to that paper? So the radiology resident says, well, actually the nuclear medicine people had also already written up a case report and submitted it to their journal. So that's not fair. They should have asked us. So I call up the head of nuclear medicine and say, you know, this is not right. So the head of nuclear medicine says that, well, I agree with you, it should not have been done, but I didn't realize they hadn't told me, or something like that. May I request you to mute your mic, please? Vijay Kumar Sharma. Vijay Kumar Sharma, if you could mute your mic. Dr. Sharma, possible to mute your mic? Okay, thank you. All right, so I said, but you know, you should have, how can you just do a nuclear thing? You would have needed some clinical data. Yeah, but we didn't say much about the clinical data. I said, but without that, the story was incomplete. I agree with you. If the paper comes back, gets rejected, we will write a single consolidated paper. I said, okay. A few months again go by, and I still forget about this. And then one day I encounter this radiology resident again, and I ask her, what happened? So she said the paper came back. The nuclear medicine resident called me and said, we'll put your name on it. And we then send the paper. So a whole story is always better than parts of a story. So if you've got data which is radiology, pathology, and clinical, it will always be better if it's the whole story rather than parts of the paper. So if some patients overlap, if there are parts of previous publications which overlap, look at this information very carefully and provide full disclosure if you're going to submit this to a journal. Can I justify duplicate publication? Yes, there are some instances where I can justify duplicate publication. I could publish in a local journal, especially in a non-English language speaking journal, and then realize that this information is now useful to others. So in China, in Wuhan, they could actually have published something in Chinese related to the COVID-19 outbreak, and then decided that this was information which was useful, and therefore gone ahead and tried to publish it in an English language speaking journal. This could be one after the other, or it could happen simultaneously, depending upon what and how important the information was. Similarly, if you had a very large study, Framingham cohort. So if you're a large cohort, you'll keep getting data from this cohort at different points in time. What is important is that you keep disclosing to people. Also, if your conclusions are multidisciplinary, if I was to do a paper on cardiovascular diseases, and I wish to address an audience of neurologists, endocrinologists, and cardiologists, I would need to write 3 different papers for 3 different audiences, unless there was enough for a general medical audience, and my paper was simple enough for a general medical audience. But what is important is that you need to be transparent and tell people that this is what you're doing. So these are 2 examples, a paper published in the BMJ and the New England Journal of Medicine. Essentially, the data related to glucose tolerance, but they created 2 papers out of it, submitted both papers to both journals, and told them this is what we are doing. They informed the editors, justified it, and the editors, when they accepted the arguments, published their arguments and the justification. How do you decide one paper is more informative? If you're not sure, submit and inform to the editor. I'm submitting 2 papers. The editor could tell you submit a single paper, combine it and put it into a single thing. What about incremental follow-up? I've already said that incremental follow-up, if you have a change in the message or you have a substantial increase in the data, only then consider incremental follow-up. Preferably have little or no overlap of data when you do such publications. If you're published in any form, please declare and say there could be a possible overlap. Possibly send copies of your previous publication to the editor of the journal. Now, if problems related to publication misconduct were to get identified prior to publication, most often by the reviewer or sometimes by the editorial office, then you would receive a polite letter and be asked as to whether you have an explanation for this. Sometimes people have a motive behind doing this. Other times they just make an excuse and say we were not aware that we were allowed to do this or not allowed to do this. Now, a number of journals in their instructions to authors would say you're not permitted to do duplicate submission, you're not supposed to plagiarize, etc., etc. And therefore you can't take refuge in the explanation of me not being aware. You were supposed to have read the instructions to authors, and therefore you should have been aware. If this happens after publication, then your paper would definitely be retracted. There could possibly be a notice in the journal saying why this paper has been retracted. In addition to that, your institution could be informed, and the institution might decide to take further action, hold an inquiry, and find out how serious the misdemeanor was. So here's an example of a repetitive publication, which finally got retracted. The gentleman wanted to publish an image, first publish it in one journal, then a second journal, and then decided why not have a go at the New England Journal of Medicine. Published it, but then got caught out for all the 3 different images that he published. So here's the kind of retraction notices that may appear within the pages of a journal. Here's a paper which was retracted because it contained plagiarized material, and there's an explanation there by the journal itself. Or you may have something called an expression of concern, and these expressions of concern could be published in the pages of the journal in instances where the journal cannot with certainty obtain evidence, conclusive evidence of the misdemeanor. And therefore, a number of journals would not take the step of withdrawing the paper, because you could, as the author, feel hurt about it, unproved allegation, and therefore you could go to a court of law and say that I've been defamed. And therefore, because of this, a lot of these big journals, general medical journals, such as the Lancet, which publish this, have large legal departments who would advise them on whether they should retract the paper, publish a retraction notice, or publish an expression of concern. So the possible problems that you could encounter would be your institution could get informed, journals could request an inquiry, the inquiry would happen with strict confidentiality. So until the misdemeanor, the misconduct was proven, the institution would keep the matter confidential. But once it was proven, they might release this information to everybody within the institution to let them know that they've taken action, because this could be a deterrent for other people who may indulge in similar practices. If you get into a problem, or you have a friend who's getting into such a problem, there are places where you could get help from. These are resources available. These are online resources. The World Association of Medical Editors, WAME, pronounced WAME, has an ethics committee. I and Dr. Rakesh Agarwal are members of this. And if you write to this ethics committee with an issue that you've encountered, they would give you advice on what is to be done. Unfortunately or fortunately, they don't have any legal standing. So all that they can do is advise you on what is possible. Similarly, the Committee on Publication Ethics based in the UK, which has over 5,000 editors and members, but across all sciences, they too could give you instruction on how to proceed with a particular matter. One of the things that the Committee on Publication Ethics has on its website is a certain set of flowcharts, and you could look at, if you were to indulge in duplicate publication, and you were to get caught out, what are the possible actions that the COPE recommends? Similarly for plagiarism, similarly for suspected fabrication, etc. Similarly for authorship issues. So if at the last count I did of these charts, there are 14 of these charts. It's very simple to understand, and you could go to the website, publicationethics.org, www.publicationethics.org, and download these and read them at leisure. They're available in different languages also, but I don't think there's a translation in Hindi yet. So if there's a minor misdemeanor, you could probably have a reprimand. If it's a major misdemeanor, you could lose job or you could lose face. Often institutions don't act, they prefer to brush this under the carpet. But in those instances, journal editors tend to be more proactive and publish the information in the pages of the journal. So I'm not going to talk about the ethical issues related to peer review. I've already talked about Theodore Fox. We all know it's not perfect. We also know that it's all based on trust and a certain amount of transparency. I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions rather than go on and talk about some of these issues. Some of these I've already covered. I've talked about who's the best peer reviewer. Conflict of interest. That's something that we have got to talk about. So ties with activities that could inappropriately influence your judgment. And you can't decide as to whether it's influenced your judgment or not. So therefore, if there is any activity with which you
Hello. Piyush, we seem to have lost you.
Hello.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, you lost me in between.
Yes, just for a minute or less than a minute, actually.
Okay, so conflict of interest is ties with activities that could influence your judgment. And it's not necessary that your judgment is actually influenced or not. Just the fact that it could influence your judgment is something that you need to disclose. Now, these could be financial, these could be personal, or these could be academic. And these conflicts of interest could relate to authors, to reviewers, as well as editors. So most editors at the beginning of a year would disclose their conflicts of interest. So if you look at financial conflicts, one of the examples is papers get published in the New England Journal of Medicine on Thursday evening. And on Friday morning, they influence the pharma stocks on the New York Stock Exchange. So if Pfizer's vaccine has turned out to be good, Pfizer's stock goes up. And if you as a researcher had a huge holding of Pfizer stocks, then you are expected to benefit from it. You should therefore disclose this conflict of interest. There could be a personal conflict of interest. I could be biased against somebody and therefore judge that person's work unfairly. And or I could be working closely with somebody and therefore maybe positively biased towards that person. And again, I should disclose that I'm working with someone and therefore I may be biased in my judgment of that person's work. Similarly, there could be academic conflicts of interest where I compete with somebody else for a job, for a promotion, or doing the same kind of work. And all these should be disclosed. And there are a number of other things that also need to be disclosed, but these are the most important ones. So in summary, there are multiple issues and multiple players in the editorial process as well as in scientific misconduct. It's important to be aware of them. Guard against the temptation. So the temptation to indulge in misconduct can sometimes be high, especially if you're waiting for a promotion and you don't want somebody else who's your contemporary or someone who's junior whom you think might go above you. And that's when you need to guard against the temptation. Detection today is easier and therefore the consequences can be more serious. There is in fact a website which is called Retraction Watch, which actively looks for retractions and then writes as to why papers were retracted. And editors are certainly more proactive. So that's where I'll stop.